founders of the Weather Underground. That's all true. And I was underground for 11 years. I had 2 children underground. I surfaced in 1981, I believe. And so I'm not hiding that history. And I wrote a book about the years of the Vietnam War, the years 1965 to 75, called Fugitive Days. And that book comes directly to terms with everything I did and everything that I'm culpable of, everything I'm sorry for, and it's all there. I have a book coming out next month. Write it down. Go to Amazon. I'm teasing, and it's called Public Enemy. I'm sorry.
Go to your local bookstore and support them, please.
Support your independent bookstore, 57th Street Books in Chicago, or Women and Children First. I'll be reading at both places. In fact, come to International House, University of Chicago, October 9th. I'll be reading for 57th Street Books. I agree with you, independent booksellers. The book is called Public Enemy, Confessions of an American Dissident. And one of the things that that book takes up, it takes off where Fugitive Days left off, but it takes up the question, well, a lot of it is about parenting and teaching, which is a lot what I've done in the last 30 years. But it also takes up the question of trying to suppress the ability to have an honest conversation about lots of things, and Vietnam is one of them. So it was just announced that there's going to be a 10-year celebration. The Pentagon is hosting a 10-year celebration of the Vietnam War. Now, anyone who lived through it, I think, finds it hard to believe that this is true. It's true that what I did was extreme. It's true that much of it was illegal. It's true that a lot of it went right off the tracks. A lot of it I regret, which I've written about endlessly, and a lot of it I don't regret, which I've also written about. But here was the situation. I was arrested in 1965 opposing the war in Vietnam. I was 21 years old. I was in a draft board destroying draft files. And there were 39 of us there. We were arrested, we were put in jail, and we did, our sentence for what we'd done. At that point, 1965, 80% of Americans supported the war in Vietnam. 3 years later, over half of Americans opposed the war in Vietnam. What happened? Well, what happened was 3 important things. One is that anti-war activists were active. 2 is the Black Freedom Movement came out unequivocally against the war. And if you want to read one speech by Martin Luther King that will illuminate who King really was beyond the myth of King, read his speech April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church. It's a speech in which he says, the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. It's a speech in which he says we're on the wrong side of the world revolution. It's a speech in which he says we have to oppose militarism, racism, and materialism if we're going to move forward. It's a speech in which he says we need a revolution in values in order to have a revolution in fact. King said that, not Malcolm X. The way King is sanctified, it becomes kind of... So that was important. And a third thing that happened is GIs came home and told this plain, unvarnished truth about what they were asked to do by us in Vietnam. John Kerry, whatever you think of him, he's now the Secretary of State. He ran for president. As a 25-year-old, he testified before Congress, and he said this, quote, "We commit war crimes in Vietnam every day, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of policy." That's what he said. The country turned against the war, and yet the war dragged on. And here's the sad truth. Every year the war went on, for those 5 years after the American people were opposed to it, or 7 years, every week that the war went on, 6,000 innocent people were killed. Every week. So you had a World Trade Center every week for 7 years, and we couldn't stop the war. So those of us who were anti-war activists, we tried to figure out what to do. And in my own family, I'm the middle of 5 kids, grew up in great privilege in Chicago. One of my siblings ran away to the communes. To get the hell away from it. One went to Europe to get away from it. One went into the factories of Indiana to try to build a kind of consciousness among industrial workers. One joined the Democratic Party to try to build a peace wing in it. And I did what I did. And I don't think what I did was brilliant or wonderful, and I'm surely not recommending it to students at Elgin Community College, believe me. But it was not as off the rocks as it sounds. And I'm happy. I've said many times, and I say it deeply in Public Enemy, I'd be happy to have a truth and reconciliation process in which John McCain stands on the same stage with George Bush and Dick Cheney and me, and we all say what we did and what we're culpable for. I killed no one. McCain actually killed people in a war of terror from the air, and that's what John Kerry said when he was 25 years old, and that is the truth. So I'm glad that war ended. I wish we could end these wars. I do not think they make us safer. In fact, I think one of the fascinating things about the current moment we're all looking at and living through, the day before, this is so interesting. You can always count on the hawks. John McCain and Lindsey Graham, there's no problem too big or too small for a guided missile. They can always bomb something. And John McCain, who's been wrong on every foreign policy issue for 50 years, is still called upon as the great thinker on this stuff. I can't believe it. They're no fun to watch because they always want to send a guided missile. The fun people to watch are the liberals, the liberal hawks, the people who say on MSNBC, who say, oh, the president was right to go to Congress, and Congress better vote to bomb things or the president will never go again. What are they thinking? And aren't there 10 alternatives you could think of, you, here at Elgin Community College, to either bombing or doing nothing? I can think of 10 things. I can think of 100 things. Interestingly, the day before, somebody said, why don't you give your chemical weapons to an international body? You and I weren't thinking about it. As soon as it was said, hey, that's an alternative to war. Right there. Think of alternatives to war. Think of alternatives to incarceration. Think of alternatives to always leading with violence. And then we'll be a better people and a better country.
Okay,
Got some right here.
I actually have two questions. My first one is, I have nothing against, opposing wars or wars. I don't say anything about that. But what I have a question for you is, are you opposed to the government in the wars, or are you opposed to the servicemen who serve in the wars?
Well, let me answer that one first. I absolutely, the people who send people into battle are the people who I think are culpable. So when you look at something like, you guys don't know about this, but there was a horrible, horrible war crime committed in Vietnam called My Lai, and the people who took the fall for it were guys on the ground. And my feeling was the guys on the ground were responsible for what they did. Absolutely they were. But if you're going to charge them, you better start working your way up the ladder and charge McNamara and charge Kissinger and charge Nixon. They're all responsible. And who put them there? So I don't think we should mindlessly follow along. I think we should recognize that in our military, and this is a sad comment too, we have a kind of a French Foreign Legion for a military. In a democracy, in my view, there ought to be citizen armies. There ought to be, and we as a people should decide what we want to engage in, what we don't want to engage in. I actually have proposed for a long time a mandatory draft. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn a lot of you against me. A mandatory draft for 18-year-olds. And here's how it works. Everyone who's 18 has to do a year of service. And as I said earlier, service means working in an ER, working in a daycare center, my favorite, taking care of old people. Thank you. Or the military. But there might be 10 options that you could choose. 1 year of service when you're 18. And here's where people really get off board. 1 year of service at 28, 1 year of service at 38, 48, 58, and then you're free. But it seems to me if we want to be part of a society that cares for one another, we ought to say to ourselves, yes, we can do this. And we should not be down, we shouldn't beat the hell out of the people who are simply going into the army because, look, my students, most of them joined the service to get an education. And then 9/11 happened, They had no intention of, but it's kind of a sad comment that in order to become an early childhood teacher, you have to walk through the furnace of war in Iraq. Why? Why couldn't we say, yeah, you could be So, no, I don't blame people have individual culpability, but the real responsibility goes to those who send them. What's your second one?
My second one was about public versus privilege. You always talk about how to have equality in classrooms, you're always talking about the public schools. So are you saying you don't like private schools? Or, what's the difference? Because everybody says private schools in general are more privileged than the public.
Well, they are because they cost money, but no, I think what we need to aspire to is a vibrant, complex, dynamic public school system. I don't think we should give up on that. And I actually think a lot of the motion towards charters and vouchers and so on is undermining the idea that we could have a common a common school or a public school system. That's where our hope lies. I'm not at all against Catholic schools or Jewish schools or private schools. That's fine. But it doesn't answer the problem of what about most people? What about the masses of us? We deserve a decent education, and we can't organize it for ourselves. So you're a kid born on the west side of Chicago to a single teenage mother, and she's got a drug problem and her old man is in prison. Should you not have access to a good education? You didn't do anything. You're 6 months old. You know, I think you ought to have access to a decent education too, and you shouldn't be punished for the sins of your fathers.
Okay, we're going to take one. We'll take one more. The woman in the back, wait till you get the microphone this week. Here we go.
I'm going to try my best to be
Microphone.
Okay. First of all, you were talking, first of all, my mother taught, she was a teacher. She taught at the University of Miami in languages. And as a matter of fact, I distinctly remember as a young child, all of the Cubanos, fleeing Castro's communist regime. And she taught immerse English as a second language. Within 6 months, they were speaking Spanish. The fact of the matter is that all of this multiculturalism and all of this other stuff comes from the radical left. And it is a way to keep people, minorities, okay, having a smaller piece of the economic pie. Now, I was part of the 60s. I was running around, peace now, anti-war, this,
You're
that,
too
whatever.
young to be part of the
I am?
60s. Come
Well,
on.
you know what? I was like 12 years old. I didn't
You
know
were
what I
3
was
years
doing.
old. Okay.
But you know what? You know what? I was one of Stalin's, quote, useful idiots. And you know exactly what I'm talking
I
about.
have no idea what you're talking about.
The question is, I find it incredibly baffling that you would be here in a humanities program having the absolute audacity to be talking about democracy and education when you wrote your communist manifesto called
That was Marx. who
Prairie
wrote-
Fire.
Oh,
Listen,
okay.
let me tell you
I
something.
thought you thought I was Marx. But, okay.
Yes, where it quickly says that you are a communist, and the fact of the matter is it's not illegal, and that you and your friends are going to have a revolution, and you are going to implement communism and complete power. And as you know, there's a famous professor who stated very clearly, and you know who she is, okay, communism and fascism
Who's this?
are opposite sides of the same coin. They're
Who said this? I'm sorry.
totalitarian. So this has been your ideology for the past 40 years. You just said a few years ago you're a communist. You've been part of the Communist Party USA.
No.
Okay, we need a question,
How
Anna.
can you teach people in an unbiased way, students who have been fed propaganda, okay?
Okay, I'm going to
About
take this. Listen,
democracy?
I'll take this in one way.
It's not possible.
Okay, I assume.
Let him answer. Let him
Okay,
answer.
I assume.
Answer that question.
I will. I assume number one that you agreed.
Almost got me as a useful idiot.
I don't know what that means, but
You
I
do, and don't you dare lie.
I assume by your question that you agree with everything I said because you didn't take any of it on. But now you've also kind of said ad hominem that I have no right to bring the message because I'm a bad person. But the fact is, a lot of what you've got is. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I said stop it and act mature.
I don't know what you're talking about, honestly. You said I'm a member of the Communist Party USA. Never, ever, ever. So, okay, so all I'm going to do is say this. Look, thank you all for coming. I assume that she agrees with everything I said because she didn't contradict any of it. But, and maybe I'm a bad messenger, and that's for you to decide. But the fact is that there's nothing about any of our history that says we aren't allowed to then speak in the public space. So I'm speaking in the public space. She is, we are. And that's how it should be. Thank you so much for inviting me to Elgin Community College. Listen, any of you who are going to be teachers, you're going to be a teacher? Take this book. You're going to be a teacher? Take this book. You're more than welcome. I'm glad I could be here. I knew I recognized you. I knew I recognized you.
Let the press ask me questions.
How are you, sir? Thanks for coming.